Hello, it's Amy. I'm back again to talk about another book on books. This is The Book Hunter by John Hill Burton. And this is an earlier relative to some of the other books on books that I've read and talked about on this channel. It's an earlier book on books from 1862. This is not the 1862 edition. This edition is probably, although there's no date in it, probably from the 1930s. There is a dedication from a previous owner from 1935. But overall, this is a reprinting. We've got the author's advertisement to the second edition here. But this one is edited by J. Herbert Slater. And I read one of Slater's books on book collecting a couple years back. But this is my first time trying to read John Hill Burton. He was a Scottish author, died in 1888. I believe he was born around the turn of the 19th century. 1802 or 1803, somewhere along there. But it's exactly what the title leads you to believe it is. It is a book on book hunting and book collecting. And so far, I've made it through the introduction and the first chapter. The first chapter is on mighty book hunters. Now, when I say I've made it through, that's sort of how I'm feeling reading this one. Although I'm really enjoying, the stories, those nuggets of information. The writing style is quite cumbersome to read through, which is why I started reading the introduction. Decided my mind wasn't sharp enough for it. Set it aside. Came back a couple weeks later, read through the first whole chapter, realized that my mind was glazing over, and I couldn't remember a thing that I'd read. So I set it aside again, picked it up over the weekend, and took another go at the first chapter. And this time my mind was sharp enough that I was able to read and understand. And I'm not sure what it is about it, whether it's the actual text or whether it's the size of the print and the structure in which the print is laid out on the page. Being as it's a work from the 1860s, the style, of course, is long block paragraphs and long winding sentences. And so it can be read. It just requires a little more attention to detail than other works. But I enjoyed what I read. And he focuses on a couple of, famous book hunters of his day or slightly before his day. And I'm going to read to you one of his sections on one of those book collectors. And I'm opening it up in the wrong spot. That's the second chapter on classification. But the chapter here is titled A Vision of Mighty Book Hunters. And we're going to focus on his account of the Archdeacon Meadows. And he gives a couple of examples of mighty book hunters here. Only one of the names I'm actually familiar with. He talks about De Quincey at the end to close out the chapter. But I think for the most part, it's not just about the individual book collector, the book hunter. It's also about showing you a type of book hunter and collector. Because each of the people that he sort of highlights in this chapter is a different kind of collector. They've got different characteristics. And it's interesting because we do see this, repeated in books following this for, the next 150 years, right up to today. When you're talking about books on books, there is this idea of different types of readers, different types of book collectors. And so we have an 1860s example of that. So Archdeacon Meadows. As the first case, let us summon from the shades my venerable friend Archdeacon Meadows, as he was in the body. You see him now, tall, straight, and meagre, but with a grim dignity in his air, which warms into benignity as he inspects a pretty little clean Elzevir or a tall, portly Stevens, concluding his inward estimate of the prize with a peculiar grunting chuckle, known by the initiated to be an important announcement. This is no doubt one of the milder and more inoffensive types, but still a thoroughly confirmed and obstinate case. Its parallel to the classes who are taken charge of by their wiser neighbours is only too close and awful. For have not sometimes the female members of his household been known on occasion of some domestic emergency, or it may be for mere sake of keeping the lost man out of mischief, to have been searching for him on some bookstall unto bookstall, just as the mothers, wives, and daughters of other lost men hunt them through their favourite taverns or gambling houses? Then again, can one forget that occasion of his going to London to be examined by a committee of the House of Commons, when he suddenly disappeared with all his money in his pocket and returned penniless, followed by a wagon containing 372 copies of rare editions of the Bible? All were fish that came to his net. At one time you might find him securing a minnow for 6 pence at a stall, and presently afterwards he outbids some princely collector and secures with frantic impetuosity at any price a great fish he has been patiently watching year after year. His hunting grounds were wide and distant, and there were mysterious rumours about the number of copies, all identically the same in addition and minor individualities, which he possessed of certain books. I have known him indeed, when beaten at auction, to turn around resignedly and say, "Well, so be it, but I dare say I have 10 or 12 copies at home, if I could lay hands on them." It is a matter of extreme anxiety to his friends, and if he have a well-constituted mind, of sad misgiving to himself, when the collector buys his first duplicate. It is like the first secret dram swallowed in the forenoon, the first pawning of the silver spoons, or any other terrible first step downwards you may please to liken it to. There is no hope for the patient after this. And I'm going to pause because I find this quite funny that, book buying and book collecting has been compared to, gambling and drunkenness and, wasting all your money, squandering all your money, and, your friends and family have to go and look for you, and how the first downfall is the duplicate book. As I stare across my room at a shelf with a couple of duplicates, I have duplicate J.M. Barries. Now, to be fair, it's not the exact same editions. It's different editions of the same book. But I think perhaps you got the collector's bug when you have duplicates. And I've had duplicates on my shelves for many years. There is no hope for the patient after this. It rends at once the veil of decorum spun out of the flimsy sophisms by which he has been deceiving his friends and partially deceiving himself into the belief that his previous purchases were necessary, or at all events serviceable for professional and literary purposes. He now becomes shameless and hardened, and it is observable in the career of this class of unfortunates that the first act of duplicity is immediately followed by an access of the disorder and a reckless abandonment to his propensities. The Archdeacon had long passed this stage ere he crossed my path, and had become thoroughly hardened. He was not remarkable for local attachment, and in moving from place to place, his spoil, packed in innumerable great boxes, sometimes followed him, to remain unreleased during the whole period of his tarrying in his new abode, so that they were removed to the next stage of his journey through life with modified inconvenience. Now that is not something I would ever do, nor I think that most of us watching this channel would ever do. Live in a place and leave our books in boxes, not to be looked at, not to be read, and I suppose not staying long enough to unpack them. Now, for myself, I think, I would only not unpack if I was only staying, maybe a few weeks in a place. But any longer than a few weeks, and I'm pretty sure all the books would be coming out, onto the shelves so I can see them and read them and enjoy them. But apparently the Archdeacon Meadows did not unpack. Cruel as it may seem, I must yet notice another and a peculiar vagary of his malady. He had resolved at least once in his life to part with a considerable proportion of his collection, better to suffer the anguish of such an act than endure the fretting of continued restraint. There was a wondrous sale by auction accordingly. It was something like that what may have occurred on the dissolution of the monasteries at the Reformation. And we have a footnote here. In the light of subsequent research, nothing of the kind could well have occurred. The first public sale of books was held at London no earlier than 1604, and the first sale of the kind in this country was not held until 1676. So he's just noting, Burton here is noting that a sale at a monastery at the Reformation would not have taken place. But you can well imagine that kind of comparison with the kind of riches a monastery of that Reformation era would have had in terms of its library. Or when the contents of some time-honored public library were realized at the period of the French Revolution. Before the affair was over, the Archdeacon himself made his appearance in the midst of the miscellaneous self-invited guests, who were making free with his treasures. He pretended, honest man, to be a mere casual spectator who, having seen in passing the announcement of a sale by auction, stepped in like the rest of the public. By degrees he got excited, gasped once or twice as if mastering some desperate impulse, and at length fairly bayed. He could not brazen out the effect of this escapade, however, and disappeared from the scene. It was remarked by the observant that an unusual number of lots were afterwards knocked down to a military gentleman who seemed to have left portentously large orders with the auctioneer. Some curious suspicions began to arise, which were settled by that presiding genius bending over his rostrum and explaining in a confidential whisper that the military hero was in reality a pillar of the church, so disguised. The Archdeacon lay under what, among a portion of the victims of his malady, was deemed a heavy scandal. He was suspected of reading his own books, that is to say, when he could get at them, for there are those who may still remember his rather shamefaced apparition of an evening petitioning somewhat in the tone with which an old schoolfellow down in the world requests your assistance to help him go to York to get an appointment, petitioning for the loan of a volume of which he could not deny that he possessed numberless copies, lurking in diverse parts of his vast collection. This reputation of reading the books in his collection, which should be sacred to external inspection solely, is, with a certain school of book collectors, a scandal, such as it would be among a hunting set to hint that a man had killed a fox. In the dialogues, not always the most entertaining of Dibdin's bibliomania, there is this short passage. "I will frankly confess," rejoined Lysander, "that I am an arrant bibliomaniac, that I love books dearly, that the very sight, touch, and mere perusal—" "Hold, my friend," again exclaimed Philemon, "you have renounced your profession. You talk of reading books. Do bibliomaniacs ever read books?" Yes, the Archdeacon read books. He devoured them, and he did so to full prolific purpose. His was a mind enriched with varied learning, which he gave forth with full, strong, easy flow, like an inexhaustible, perennial spring coming from inner reservoirs, never dry, yet too capricious to exhibit the brawling, bubbling symptoms of repletion. It was from a majestic heedlessness of the busy world and its fame that he got the character of indolence, and was set down as one who would leave no lasting memorial on his great learning. But when he died, it was not altogether without leaving a sign. For from the casual droppings of his pen has been preserved enough to signify to many generations of students in the walk he chiefly effected how richly his mind was stored, and how much fresh matter there is in those fields of inquiry where compilers have left their dreary tracts for ardent students to cultivate into a rich harvest. In him truly the bibliomania may be counted among the many illustrations of the truth so often moralized on, that the highest natures are not exempt from human frailty in some shape or another. And that is the end of the section on the Archdeacon Meadow. If you did enjoy that, if you did indeed enjoy that, I can come back and read you a couple more sections here on the various book hunters, because next up we have the Fitzpatrick Smart Esquire, who has some different collecting tendencies. Now, I have to admit, when reading about book collectors, I am a little bit, taken aback, almost offended, if you will, by the idea of a collector who would not read their books, and by the idea that it might be, scandalous or unheard of for a collector to be reading. But on the other hand, I think it's quite, scandalous that a collector would lose track of what they own, to the point where they would have to ask a friend for the loan of a book that they own, maybe a dozen copies of, because they've got so much, and it's in so much disarray, that it has essentially become hoarding, and they have no idea where the books they want are. In my opinion, at least, a good book collection is always in order. And even if things are not, organized by some, pre-thought out system, at least in your own mind, you always know where the books are. But we'll leave it at that. So this is The Book Hunter by Burton from 1862.